are a lot of running back stats out there like yards created per touch, yards per carry, elusiveness, evaded tackles, and many, many more. And while those stats are not inherently bad, they don't really do a good job of predicting a running back's future, especially when it comes to fantasy football. But there is one stat that has almost a 100% success rate when predicting a running back's future. But I gotta warn you, you're not gonna like it when you hear it. Now before I get to that stat, here is something I think you will like, and that is taking mine and Pierre's hard-earned cash and putting it in your pocket. That's right, all off-season long, we are going to be creating dynasty leagues for our members with cash prizes. $100 to first place, $50 to second place, free endgame t-shirts to everyone who joins. All you have to do is be a member at flockfantasy.com/endgame. Make sure you use promo code endgame when you sign up. Go into the Discord server, send me a DM, and I will get you the link to the Dynasty League where you can win cash money and get a free shirt. Not to mention all the other incredible perks you get by being a member at flockfantasy.com/endgame. And if you act now, 30% off any subscription. Don't wait. Come test your Dynasty skills against Pierre and myself and see if you could take our money. So last year I started doing a lot of research into can we predict who the good running backs will be this year, and can we predict when running backs will begin to fall off. And while predicting the good running backs was challenging, I was able to do it fairly well. But what I really found when doing this research is it's fairly easy to predict running backs who are going to fall off and have a general idea of how much they will fall off. Because there is a stat that pretty accurately predicts almost to 100% certainty when a running back will start to decline in terms of fantasy points scored, and that is touches. Now real quick, when I say touches, I mean rushing attempts plus receptions. So when I came out of this research, I created what I call 3 colored zones. There's the yellow zone, the orange zone, and the red zone. The yellow zone is for running backs entering the season with at least 1,200 touches, but no more than 1,499 touches. The orange zone is for running backs with at least 1,500 touches, but no more than 1,799 touches. And the red zone is 1,800 touches or more. And based on my research, each one of these zones will predict a steeper drop-off, and that running back should be considered closer to their cliff. And look, last year when I started publishing this stuff, I got a lot of pushback from people saying, the 2000 running back draft class is one of the best draft classes. They will prove this wrong. And guess what? They didn't, because there were 5 running backs who entered last year with at least 1,200 touches, and all 5 of them dropped at least 2 fantasy points per game, and some even as much as 4 or 5 fantasy points per game from the previous year. We had 3 running backs who entered last season in the yellow zone: Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, and Alvin Kamara. Dalvin Cook saw his points per game drop by 2 from the previous year. Joe Mixon also saw his points per game drop by 2 from the previous year, but if you take out that crazy 5-touchdown, 55-point game, his points per game dropped by almost 5 per game. And Alvin Kamara, even though he was bad the year before, still saw his fantasy points per game drop by 4 from the previous year. We actually had 2 running backs that entered the red zone last year, but one of them was Melvin Gordon. Like, we don't need to talk about him. But we did have Ezekiel Elliott enter the red zone last year, and I was telling everybody that would listen, Ezekiel Elliott is dust. Stop drafting Ezekiel Elliott. And he was complete dust. And despite only averaging just over 14 points per game in 2021, in 2022, his points per game somehow went down by 2 points, and he averaged barely over 12 points per game. So even though he didn't have a long way to go down, he still went down. Now you may have noticed I skipped the orange zone. That's because we had 1 running back in the orange zone last year, and it was King Henry. And I know what you're thinking. King Henry was great last year. And yes, King Henry was still very good last year, but that's because he had a lot of room to drop. But Derrick Henry's point total from the previous year dropped a whopping 5.3 points, and it was his lowest points per game total since 2018. So even King Henry is not immune to the touch factor. Let's talk about the running backs who are entering this year in these zones and how we should feel about them. We have some truly big names here, but let's start in the yellow zone, and let's start with Austin Ekeler, who just went over the 1,200 touch mark. Now, the good thing for Austin Ekeler here is he's coming off a monster season where he averaged 21 points per game. So even if he had a massive drop, like 4 points per game, he would still be great in fantasy. But he's barely on that 1,200 touch range. I don't expect a big drop. I still think Austin Ekeler will at least be very good in fantasy this year. Not too worried about Austin Ekeler. Next, we have Saquon Barkley, who had a big bounce back year last year and also just crossed that 1,200 touch mark. And now I'm a little more worried about Saquon Barkley for a couple of reasons. Number one, even though he was great last year, his points per game average was still only 17. If he loses 2 points this year, that's a 15 point per game average, which isn't terrible, but not what you're looking for from your stud top 5 running back. Also, a lot of his touches are between the tackles against big dudes, whereas Austin Eckler gets a lot of his touches on receptions more out in space. So I do think we will see a decline from Saquon Barkley this year. I could see him drop down to that 15 points per game mark. So for me, I still like Saquon. I'll still draft Saquon. I think people might just be a little too high on him after a really good 2022. Next up, we had Josh Jacobs, who just had a career year last year with the Raiders. He's now on the franchise tag. He technically hasn't signed his franchise tag, but let's assume he does. He also has just crossed the 1,200 mark. Just came off a season where he almost had 400 touches last year. But again, like Austin Eckler, he averaged 20 points per game. So even if he had a big drop, we're still talking probably 17, 16 points per game. And he's still a younger guy. So I'm not quite as worried about Josh Jacobs. Even if he drops a little bit this year, he should still be solid. Then we have Aaron Jones, who's really old and somehow only has 1,277 touches because he just hasn't been used that way. He was still very efficient last year, but we did see his points per game drop, and I think we probably see it again. The issue here is he wasn't putting up big numbers anyway, so any kind of a drop is really going to be felt. I mean, if he goes from 14 points per game to 12, you're not going to feel very good about him, but he's not being drafted very highly anymore. I think it is ADP. He's fair value. Just understand his best days are almost certainly behind him, and you're getting more of a floor Aaron Jones and less of a ceiling Aaron Jones. And then we have everybody's favorite, Nick Chubb, who is now well over 1,300 touches, coming off his best season last year. Again, I gotta think we see a little bit of a drop from Nick Chubb. He's in that touch range. He's a guy who gets a lot of between the tackles touches. He's had a lot of wear and tear on his body. He doesn't get those catches out in space very often. And he's another guy like Saquon Barkley, had a nice season last year, especially the first half, but didn't put up huge numbers down the stretch. So if we see his points per game drop by 2 or 3, he's really not going to pay off this year. And right now, he's being drafted as like a top 6 running back. I just think that's crazy. Too much risk for Nick Chubb. I'll draft him if he drops far enough, but he doesn't. So I'm probably not going to have any Nick Chubb this year. Next up, we have Big Leonard Fournette, who's not even on a team right now, who's complete dust last year, well over 1,400 touches. I mean, he's dust. If you don't think he's dust, I don't know what to tell you. He's dust. Move on. Finally, in the yellow zone, we have a very big name, and that is Christian McCaffrey, getting very close to that 1,500 touch mark. And I got to admit, Christian McCaffrey is very polarizing for me. On the one hand, we know what his upside is. On the other hand, we're talking about a guy who over the span of 2 years only played 10 games, has a ton of wear and tear on him. I don't think the 49ers are just going to run him into the ground. That being said, he was so good last year, 21 points per game. Even if he dropped 4 points per game, you're still talking about a 17 point per game running back. I think you got to take the gamble on him. Hope he stays healthy for one more year because the upside is there. All right, we have 3 running backs entering the orange zone, but I already talked about them. Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. All of them saw at least a 2 points per game drop last year, and now they're into the orange zone. You got to think we're going to see at least another 2 to 3 point drop from each one of these guys. Each one of these guys looked really bad last year compared to their prime years. Dalvin Cook, we don't know where he's going to play. Alvin Kamara might be suspended. Joe Mixon was really bad outside of that one game. These are guys, I'm not touching Alvin Kamara. I'll draft Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon if they fall far enough, but just understand, these guys are past their prime. We've for sure seen the best of these guys. Don't count on these guys as your RB1 or even really your week in, week out RB2. And then finally, the red zone. We know Zeke is in the red zone, but he's not on a team. He's complete dust. If you're still drafting Ezekiel Elliott, I don't know what to tell you. But there's a big name we need to talk about. That is King Henry. He's now over the 1,800 touch mark, almost to 1,900 touches, almost to that 2,000, like don't even want to touch this guy mark, which he's going to hit probably within the first 4 or 5 games. Is he worth the risk? Maybe. But he wasn't as good as people think last year. Again, 18 points per game, which is fine. That's a top 5 running back. You'll take that. But we got to expect another 2 point drop at least this year for him. I could see him being more in that 15 to 16 point range, and next year being drafted as more like an RB2. And that's assuming he even stays healthy. So you want to draft Derrick Henry. I get it. He's a great player. Maybe he'll be kind of the outlier, but really there is a ton of risk when you're taking Derrick Henry. So those are some running backs who are probably set to decline in 2023. But if you want to see some players I think that are finally ready to explode, check out this video right here.